Alrighty, welcome back everyone to the React in-depth series. In this video, we're going to go over props in React together. Now, I've been waiting for this video for a while. This is probably one of the bigger videos and bigger concepts that we're going to have to get through in order to understand a lot of things in React together. In the previous video, we went over component composition, and I hinted that that kind of is a brother or sister property to props, no pun intended. And we're going to need to learn both kind of hand in hand to learn really how to really start making use of React much deeper. So in this video, we're going to go over props or properties so that we can actually start manipulating our components and start reusing them properly across various parts of our project. So we can actually not have to keep recreating components. We can actually dynamically change a component by giving it different inputs and having it give us a different output, just like functions when we first learned them. So without further ado, let's take a look at props together. Okay, so to start, I just want to really define this because this is such a central concept that it kind of gets glossed over a lot along with component composition. So I want to make sure we're all on the same page when we're going through this together. So what are props? So when you hear props, I want you to think of this concept of properties. And when you hear properties, I want you to think of properties on like JavaScript objects. So as you know, JavaScript has objects, and objects have properties and then values, right? So keep that in mind at the back of your mind every time you think of this idea of props, which is just short for properties, which is short for that idea of objects being passed to different things. So what props allow us to do in React specifically is they allow us to change what our components return. And the main central premise behind this is functions. And as we've seen, React so far, a component really is just a function that returns JSX, right? And so far, what we've been seeing is the output side of that. So we saw that we can return JSX from a function, and React will treat that as a quote unquote component and then kind of turn it into the markup or the HTML for us behind the scenes and actually render that to the DOM. So what props allow us to do is the flip side of functions, which is give it a function an input. So as we know, functions both allow us to give it an input as well as give us an output. And the output is using return, and the input is using parameters. And once they're in use, they're actually the arguments to the function. So we're actually going to focus on those parameters or arguments being passed into the functions so we can actually manipulate the different outputs just like you would a regular function in JavaScript. Now, this is, again, going hand in hand with component composition. And if we use these two concepts together, we can actually start to leverage a lot of the power behind React. So let's take a look at what I mean. All right, so over here on the slide, what I have is a paragraph component. Okay, so this is a function. Currently, it takes no inputs, and it returns some JSX that is a paragraph with the string hello monkey inside of it. Okay, and we know that this is going to render to the DOM as a paragraph element with hello monkey as a text node inside of that. Now, I want you to think for a moment. How would you normally make it so that we can change what a function returns, right? So what I mean is, like, for example, imagine we have this and we want to change hello and then the monkey part, we want to change it to whatever we want. So we want to be able to give it some kind of input so that it can manipulate its output, right? So we want to be able to change this orange part here to pretty much whatever we want dynamically without having it be hard-coded beforehand to be something like this, like the string monkey. So how is this going to work? Well, I propose that we create a parameter for this function, right? So this is what we have over here, just as a reminder up top. And now I want you to think, ignore kind of these curly brackets here in the argument list for a second, because we're going to get back to that shortly. But just pretend we have a parameter called name, okay? Now, wouldn't it be cool if inside of our JSX or inside of the output markup, we could actually kind of treat that as if it is just regular JavaScript, like a variable, right? So we know we can insert JavaScript into JSX using curly brackets, right? Now, don't get confused between the curly brackets here in the parameter list and these curly brackets. I want you to focus on these curly brackets right here, the one I have highlighted, which is the name beside hello in the paragraph tag. So in theory, we can actually fill in this orange section with kind of whatever we want as long as we pass it in as an input to this function so that it gets rendered differently as an output every single time. So one way we could do this is by calling, so it's a function, right? We can just call it. This is kind of another way we can create React components instead of using the JSX tags. And we can pass it an object, right, with a name of Moo. And we can basically see it logged out like this. So wouldn't that be nice if we could do something like this, right? Like that would be absolutely fantastic because this kind of just makes sense in JavaScript land because that's how functions work behind the scenes anyways. Now, it turns out that we actually can do this. And not only can we do this, but we can actually have a really nice syntax to actually make this work behind the scenes really, really nicely with just JSX. So again, up top, what I have is the static hard-coded version of this paragraph. And we're going to code this out in a second just so I can actually show it to you in VS Code. But I want you to look at this slide just to kind of see how this breaks down. So over here, again, I have a function. This time I've added the name, and then I'm using the name from the argument that I'm being passed in inside the actual markup. And I can see it being used in two ways. I just saw this on the previous slide, and I'm trying to explain that here we can actually see it being used using the JSX syntax, or the kind of the React specific syntax, where it kind of looks like it's being passed in like an attribute would be passed in to a regular element, right? Like an ID or a class or a style or something like that. So it turns out that this actually works, right? We can actually pass in attributes into JSX, and it actually behind the scenes gets turned into kind of this style of syntax when it calls that function using react.createElement, and we can actually get the correct output that we're looking for. Now, this is extremely, extremely powerful. I just want you to pause for a second and just think of what this opens up for us. What we're now saying is that no longer do we have to kind of create a separate React component for every single style of markup that we need. We can actually create one style of component that can be reused, and we can just pass it different input options in its argument list to actually change the resulting output, which is the JSX. And we can actually take this concept and build on it and build on it. And really, this is one of the central premises behind how React works and some of the power that it allows us to unleash on the web. So let's pull up our code editor and take a look at what this actually does for us. So I'm going to pull up VS Code here. I have my terminal on the side here. I have a folder open. I'm just going to run npm create vite at latest. And this is going to pull down a Vite project. I'll just call this props. I'm going to choose React here. I'm going to choose JavaScript, and then that's going to kind of be good to go. I'm going to switch to that folder. I'm going to run npm install. I is just the alias for install to save a little bit of typing so your fingers don't get tired. And while that kind of loads up, I'm just going to open up the main.jsx file and the app.jsx file over here. Okay. So while that's going, I'm just going to remove a whole bunch of stuff in here because we're not looking at use state yet. We're going to look at that in an upcoming video very shortly. And I'm going to return or delete, sorry, everything inside of here. So I just have the fragment and I'm just going to return an h1 for now. And I'm just going to say app just to make sure that actually works. I'm going to get rid of everything up here since we don't need any of that stuff. And we can see that that's being imported inside of our main.jsx file. And if you don't like the styling, you can get rid of that in there. We can see it's being mounted right here or being loaded up and called right here. And that's the same as actually calling the function. And we should see app as an h1 being loaded up on our screen. So just to get this started, I'm going to run npm run dev now that the node modules have been installed. And this is the URL that I can control or command click on, and it should open up in a new tab for me. And there we go. We have app as an h1, and the rest of the styling is just coming from the actual index file over there, right? So we have our h1 right here, and then the styling is just coming from the index.css from the main.jsx file. Now, we've seen all that before. What can we do with props? So let's take a look for a second at this example right here and see if we can recreate it to actually see the effects that it has. So we have a paragraph element. So let's create that. So I'm going to go to my source. I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to do paragraph.jsx. And inside of here, I'm going to say function. I'm going to call it paragraph. And in here, I'm going to return a p tag. And I'm just going to say hello monkey. In here, I'm going to hard code that. Okay, and I'm going to export default that paragraph right there. And now I can actually import it into another component. So in this case, instead of just rendering it directly into main, I'm going to use component composition and kind of put this inside of app just so we can see these things work alongside each other. So I'm going to import paragraph from paragraph. Just make sure to include the .jsx extension there as well. And I am going to put paragraph in here. Okay, and now if I switch back in here, we'll see hello monkey, which is our paragraph tag. Now, just to show you that this is really the exact same thing as calling our function paragraph, I'm going to put some markup in here, which is some JavaScript. So I'm going to surround this by curly brackets, and I'm going to just manually call the paragraph function because we see that this is just a function, and we're going to see what happens. So you can see that we get hello monkey again. Right? Now that is what we would expect because we know that behind the scenes, this is actually what is being, turns into this, and kind of React.create element takes this and actually renders it to the screen. So great. So we have kind of two components. They're kind of being duplicated here. As we can see, both of them are statically showing hello monkey. Now, it would be nice, let me zoom in a little bit more here just so we can take a look at that. It would be really nice to actually be able to change this dynamically. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a argument in here. I'm just going to call, this props. Okay. And now you're probably thinking, why Natter? Why are you calling it props? Why can't we just call it like something else, right? Does it matter what we call it? And the answer to that question is absolutely not. Just like in any argument list, we can call these whatever we want. If I wanted to, I could call this monkey. Okay, now just for confusing everyone here, why not? Let's go with this. Let's stick with monkey, and I'll prove to you that this doesn't actually really matter. So if I, inside of this paragraph function, console log monkey, I was going to say props because I was already confused. This is what's being passed in to the function. All right. Now, what do we expect to see? So look here that we're not really passing anything into the argument list. Right? We're just calling it with no arguments. What do you normally expect to see when no arguments are being passed into a function? So let me come back here to our console. I'll open the console tab, and we'll see that instead of actually getting undefined, which we normally would expect to see being passed as the default kind of function parameter, if nothing gets passed in, we actually get an object. Okay, so that's kind of curious, right? This is actually not expected behavior. I would have expected this to be undefined because I didn't actually pass in anything here. Notice there's nothing in these brackets here, and there's nothing being passed in here. So that's kind of strange. Well, what happens if we do this? What happens if I pass in moo in here? And I'll leave this one blank for now. I'll just pass in moo to paragraph, and let's see what happens. So I'm going to switch back to Chrome, and we can see that we actually get moo logged out. So let me reload the page here for a second. We'll see that we get moo logged out, which is on paragraph JSX line. Let me just zoom in a little bit here so we can see a bit better. Paragraph JSX line 2. Which is this console log right here. So what's being passed into paragraph is being logged out in this case, and we're getting moo logged out just like we'd expect as a function argument. So that's kind of confusing, right? Because we have a string here, but then we also seem to have this one is coming from the other one. This one's an object. Okay. So that's really confusing. So what happens if I pass in, like, let's just say over here, let's just say I want to pass in an attribute, and I say ID equals 1, 2, 3, and I pass that in. Do I expect to see that in props? Let's take a look. So if I switch back here, what we'll see is, yes, we do, right? We get that being logged out. Let me just refresh this page just so we can see that. We get ID in here being passed in to paragraph.jsx, and that's this one right here. And this one right here is logging out moo. So this is kind of curious, right? Because what's happening here is on line 8, we're passing in a string, and it's being logged out directly as if it's a regular function as a string. And that's where we're getting our moo, which is happening right here as our first log. This one with the object of ID 1, 2, 3, ignore the fact that this is logged twice for each. This is just coming from our extension behind the scenes, so we can actually ignore that for now. we're seeing that this one right here on line 7 is logging something different for us. This one is actually passing in ID into some kind of object, and we're logging out that object, and that object happens to have ID inside of it. Well, let's test this further. What happens if I add class equals, let's just say tree? Why not? Let's go with the monkey theme, right? So I have ID here, and then I have class equals tree. So this actually turns out to be not what we're supposed to do in React, and I'll explain why in a second, but I'll switch back here, and we see that we get class being logged out. So it looks like what's happening is everything that we're passing in as attributes here is being passed into kind of this object that just gets logged out magically. Like React is just magically wrapping these attributes into an object and then kind of giving it to us in our function, unless we call it directly with like kind of the non-React way like this and pass it a string, for example. Or if I was to pass this a number, for example, like this, we would expect to see the number 1 being logged out. Now, you would never really do this. I just want to show you that these are just regular functions, and React does something special when we use it like this, and we can simulate that, but basically doing something like this. So if I did ID, and I can say 456, and I can say class is let's just go POM, for example, and what we can see is if I reload this page, we can see that that is actually what gets logged out. So again, ignore the duplicates here. We're looking at the paragraph JSX line 2 ones here, which are coming directly from our React app. So this one gets the POM and 456, and this one gets the ID 123 and the class of tree. So really what React is doing for us behind the scenes is this. It's creating an object, putting all the attributes into that object, and then giving it to us immediately into our parameter or first argument here that we pass in, and we can log it out. We can call this whatever we want, right? We could call this monkey, we could call it args, for example, and that would do the exact same thing. If I switch back here, what we'll see is this still gets logged out just as we expect. It doesn't really matter what we call this thing. Most of the time, by convention, this is called props because that's just kind of the React nomenclature for the properties. Because if you think about this, that's what really this is. This is a bunch of attributes, but we don't really call them attributes in JavaScript. Objects have properties and values, right? So that is why this is really called props, right? Just in case you were curious. We call these props short for properties, and we can log out those props. And if we log them out, what we'll get is the exact same thing as we saw before. We will actually see all those attributes nicely wrapped in. Now, what's interesting here, before we move on to the next slide, is that we can actually pass in other things here too. So for example, I can pass in monkey equals banana. That's a very strange thing to pass in. But if I pass that in, what we'll actually see is normally you can't pass in something like this into a HTML element, because anything that's a non-standard attribute, things like ID, class, style, anything that's not those things, just gets ignored by the HTML parser, right? But it turns out that if we do this, take a look at this. What we'll get is we actually will get right here, right? We'll get monkey and banana. So what's really awesome is that we can actually pass in pretty much anything we want in here. And this is not limited to being strings. For example, I can pass in even more stuff in here. I can say age is equal to, and I have to do this as curly brackets because this is JavaScript, and I can say, for example, 20. And if I pass that in, what we'll see, I'll keep refreshing this so it doesn't go off the screen, we can see that we can pass in pretty much anything that we want into these props. Right? Now this, again, behind the scenes is just wrapping these things into an object for us, and then it's logging them out here if we want as an object. It's all wrapping them into an object right here, passing that into the first argument of the function, and by default we call that props, short for properties, and then we can access everything we want inside of there. So for example, if I wanted to actually access banana in there, I could grab it out of the props. So let's switch back to the slides just to really hammer this home because it's so important. This is what we were just doing. right? And you'll see kind of this destructuring syntax in a second. But what we were doing is we were passing in an object, and then we could dynamically change that to return different things, which I'll show you in a sec. In this case, I'm passing in the property name and giving it a value string of moo, and then I can actually get back hello moo instead of like hello monkey, for example. And I can pass in multiple of these, as many as I want. There really is no limit. And I can name them pretty much whatever I want, right? And I can give them a property name and then a property value. And then that gets passed to the actual function behind the scenes. When it actually renders a component, we can use those values inside of that function or inside of the JSX if we actually need. So this is really the mental structure, I think, really helps demonstrate this behind the scenes. So for example, let's walk through this and then we'll go back to the code and I'll show you how we can actually make this work. So imagine we have paragraph, and we saw that we were passing in random properties like monkey and age and things like that, but we can really pass in anything we want. So in this case, first name and last name abbreviated here, Bruce and Wayne. What happens behind the scenes is React is going to turn these attributes, right, or properties in this case, into props, and it's going to shove them into this object, and it's going to create that for us automatically behind the scenes, and it's going to call our function effectively, right, with that object as the first argument. Okay, this is so important to really hammer home, right? If you forget everything else in this video, I think this is the most important thing to just kind of sear into your mind, right? We get those props passed to us automatically as the first argument as an object created for us by React, where it wraps everything that is passed in as like an attribute to our tag in JSX. Okay, so here you can see that I have a paragraph component. I just called it args instead of props, just to show you that we can call it whatever we want. And we can access those values just like you would anything else in a JavaScript object. We can use the dot operator to access the value for a particular key name. So in this case, I'm saying grab from the args object the first name, which in this case is Bruce, and then grab from the args object the last name, in this case, which is Wayne, and this would evaluate to hello Bruce Wayne, because that is what is being passed into this function, into that object. All right, so let's switch back here and make that actually work for us. So if I want to, for example, grab monkey here, banana from the monkey prop, and I wanted to say hello banana instead of hello monkey, what I would do is I would actually, from that props object, right, from this set of attributes being passed in that are being wrapped as props, I can actually grab them. And for example, if I do this, if I say console.log props.monkey, I think it was, let's take a look at what that is. If I switch back here, we'll see that we get banana logged out. So this is the string value for the property called monkey in that object that's being passed in, which is being passed in here, the JSX style, using this syntax. Now, if we want to put that into the actual markup that's being returned, I can replace this monkey here with some curly brackets to show that this is no longer just static text. This is to be evaluated as a JavaScript expression. And I can say, hey, grab props.monkey and evaluate that and put that into here instead of whatever is supposed to be there instead. So this will evaluate to hello, and then whatever props.monkey is, which is banana, and then an exclamation point, all within a paragraph tag. So if I save that and I reload the page, we should see hello banana being logged out right there. Okay, now that's pretty cool. And we can see that in this case, what happened was that on the left-hand side here, it actually disappeared what's being showed up for that was not proper English. The second part of this hello actually disappeared for the second call to this function, because we're actually calling the second one here and we're not passing in a monkey prop. Right? Notice we're only passing an ID and a class here. So what's going to happen is we're calling this paragraph tag, we're grabbing monkey, which doesn't exist and it's undefined. Therefore, it's actually just going to evaluate to nothing here. And we're just going to get hello and a space and an exclamation point. Okay, which is exactly what we see over here. So if I switch back to the elements tab, we'll see that this has the correct text inside of it. And then this has only those things inside of it. Okay. Now, hopefully that makes sense. Now, before I switch back to the actual slides, I want to show you kind of that fancy syntax I had with the destructuring. And this is where a lot of people start getting confused. So let's go through this slowly together. What you saw on the slides is I had this really fancy syntax over here where I was like, okay, well, this is not props. Clearly, this is not named props, right? How can I actually easily grab stuff from an argument list without always having to do dot something, dot something, dot something? Well, I can destructure this immediately if I really want to. What does that mean? Well, if I get rid of props here and I immediately put some curly brackets in here, I'm telling JavaScript, hey, I know this is an object. I want you to pull out these specific key names for me and give me their values right away. I don't actually want the entire props object. I just want these particular ones destructured out and given to me. If this is confusing to you, I have a video on destructuring in the JavaScript series, and this is not a React specific feature. This is just a feature of JavaScript in general. We can create functions that destructure their arguments, and it's a very, very handy feature if you don't actually need everything in there and you want to avoid using .monkey. So we can, for example, do this. I can say, I want the monkey key or the monkey property immediately, and this is going to be the value for that. So instead of this right here, I'll just comment that out. We can actually just say, instead of props.monkey, props doesn't exist anymore, I can just say monkey, just like that. And that enables me to specifically list out the things that I need inside of this argument list. So if I switch back here and I reload, what we'll see is I still get hello banana because that is what's coming through into this monkey prop. If I put something in here that is not in that object, for example, if I put hello in here, right, and we know that hello is not being passed in as a property here, we only have ID, class, monkey, and age, and I try to console.log out hello, I'll just say hello, and then I'll put a comma here and I'll say hello, just like that. There's a shorter way to do that, but we'll go with that. And I refresh this page and I go to the console. What we'll see is that hello is undefined. Okay, now this is a common error that happens all the time when you're developing with React. It's really important to kind of know the actual things that are being passed to your component so that when you're doing this kind of destructuring, you're not accidentally running into issues like this where you're having something that you expect to be there but is not. Because if you imagine, if we tried to, like, let's say we expected this to be there and we did something like hello.map and then we did something to that, assuming it was an array, what we'd see is we get an error, right? We cannot read property map on undefined, which makes sense because we're trying to do undefined.map, right? So this would cause an error in our application, and that is a pretty common one to be aware of. So all that this is a destructuring of the actual keys that are being passed in here to that object, or the properties that are being passed in. And we can either go with this syntax, which is quite handy, or you can just do props or call it whatever you want and actually just use the dot operator to grab values out of it. Okay, I know I've been hammering that, but hopefully that really helps. I encourage you to play around with this and try different things to really make sure you have a handle on this, because honestly, if you can understand this idea of props, it's so central to React. Like, we're gonna be using it literally for every component almost, that you should be comfortable with the different naming conventions, the destructuring, and what happens if you pass it or don't pass it in, and how all that works. Okay, now, to wrap up this video, I wanted to go over this idea of prop drilling. Now, this is a slightly more complicated or advanced topic, but it's important to bring in here because I actually think that it's really not that much different than just the idea of props in general. So I want to show you what I mean. Now, for this example, let's assume that we have these two components, and we'll code this out in a second just so it really hammers home. We have card, the function card here, and then we have the function profile. So let's look at card for a second. Just ignore profile. In card, I'm destructuring out first name and last name, which are being passed in as props. Okay, so we just saw how that works. So we can assume that we have like a card component that's passing an F name and L name, and then they have particular values. Okay, so what this component is doing is it's going to return some markup where we have our first name and last name inside of an H1 tag. So that's great. And then we're using component composition here, where we're actually putting another React component into the card component, right? So we can do that. We've seen that in the previous video, but we're also passing that its own props. But what's different here is that we could pass it its own random props, but we happen to be passing it actually the same values that we're being passed in as our props for the card. So what's really happening here is card is receiving some props, right? And again, we'll code this and I'll go through it in detail in a second. And that is being used inside of card as we'd expect, because that's what we're doing with the props. But then we're also passing the same props down to profile. Okay. And we know that, well, that's fine. Like profile can take props. And this is kind of confusing because these names are all the same. So it's a little bit confusing, but we know that this is just the name that we want the property to be. And then on the right-hand side here is the value. So we're saying first name or F name is equal to the evaluated result of F name, which is coming from here. Hopefully it's maybe a string or something like that. Same for L name. And what's happening here is notice these arrows, okay? This purple F name, so the actual attribute name is what's being passed here. Technically what's actually happening is the value is being passed in here. So I should really actually switch these arrows to be the kind of orange and green, but I found that kind of conceptually confusing. So hopefully you can forgive me for this. Really, it's the value that's being passed in, but it's being passed in by this name. So it's these names that dictate what these names here should be, right? So if we name this different, then we would need to name these different. We'll see that in the next slide. Okay, but they actually evaluate to these values, which are these two right here. But most importantly, we can grab those. And if we look at this component in isolation, we can see, oh, great. I'm grabbing an F name and an L name. I'm going to render a div, an image tag. I can use those in an H2 if I want and show the first name and last name, and then some other stuff in there if I really want to. All right. Now, what you'll see is you'll see this kind of stuff a lot. And I really... I remember when I first saw this, it was just kind of like pretty confusing because you're kind of like, okay, like these things are named the same thing. Why are they named the same thing? And where are the names? Like which name goes where? And what's the props? And what's the value? And what if I change the name? What's going to happen? What did I change it over here? Did I change it over here? So hopefully this diagram, which I changed ever so slightly, helps clear that up, and then we'll actually code this out together to wrap up the video. Now, this slide is really no different really from this slide, just I changed very subtly the purple and the yellow property names. So over here, I have card, F name, L name being passed in. I'm using it in the card. It's an L1. I have profile as component composition in here, which is the profile element. And notice here that I am passing profile a different set of property names. But the values are the exact same. They're still the values that are being passed in from the card component. Okay, so when we declare our card, we're going to give it an F name and an L name, and that's going to come in here. And it's going to be used in the card, but it's also going to be passed to profile as its props. But since we name these props differently, first and last, instead of F name and L name, we have to destructure them or use them differently inside of the profile component because these prop names are dictated up here, right? Even though the values are the same. So in here in the profile, we can use first and last, and same thing as before. All this code is pretty much the same. It's just the variable names have changed, but the values are the exact same. Now, this is called prop drilling because we're actually taking the props from the parent here, card, and we're using them in the card, and then we're then passing them again, kind of like the hot potato game, right? We're passing it along, and we're passing it from card down to profile, and we can keep going with this if we really want to, and profile can pass it to its child or several children, and on and on and on, right? And we're kind of drilling down these props through this tree. So if you were to think of this as a tree, let me just see if I have my my other one here from our previous video. We're kind of like passing the props down, right? Like if I just created a down arrow, we're passing it through this one, and we can keep going down and down and down and down if we had more and more. All right. Now, you'll see this term come up a lot, and it can get quite confusing the first few times you use it. Hence why I said it's a little bit complex for the first few times, but it's so important to understand how this works that I need to include it in the prop video, because we're going to be using it once in a while, and there are some dangers with this idea. That if you're looking at this and you're being like, oh my gosh, this looks like it could get very hairy very quickly, you are 100% correct. If you do this too much, or you sprinkle out throughout your app, imagine you have dozens of components and a bunch of drilling, 1 level, 2 level, 3 levels deep, your component can get very messy very quickly. And it becomes very hard to kind of untangle the spaghetti web of props being drilled through components. And we'll see solutions to that as we progress through this series, and also some best practices as how to avoid that, and sometimes when it's unavoidable. So to wrap this up, let's actually take a look at this in our code. So if I, let's see here, we had a card and our profile. So I'll do a new file here. I'll just stick with the exact same example just so we don't get confused. Our card, we'll say function card. That's going to take some props. It's going to take an F name and an L name. I'll start with this slide here where we name it the same, and I'll switch it over just so we can see the difference. So I'll say F name and an L name. And inside of here, what I'll do is one of those, and I'll do export default card. And inside here, I'll say an H1, and I'll just switch back and forth here just so we can see this really quick. I'll just say F name, L name, F name, L name, and then I'm going to create a profile component next. So I'm going to click a new file. I'll call this profile.jsx, and in here I'm going to say function profile, and this is going to take its own props. For now, I'll name them the exact same thing so we can get nice and confused, and then we can clean that up a little bit if we want to, and we can return some markup over here, and I'll put that in some brackets just so it gets less confusing. And actually this was a div, so I'll do that. I'll do div here, and I'll do div here, and inside that div we have an img, and I'll just put no image source for now just so that we can actually see that working, and I'll have an h3, why not h3, and I'll put my f name like this, and my L name. And again, remember to always put anything that is JavaScript inside of curly brackets, because if I didn't have these in curly brackets, it would literally show the text F name and L name, just like it's literally going to show the text name right here. Okay, and I can put more components down here if I want to. For example, I can just put like a button. I'm going to say hello, right? Just to show you that we can have different things in here if we need to. Now this image is not going to show anything for now. It's just going to show a blank missing image link, but that's fine. I'm going to say export default, and I'll say profile here. Oop, that is not what I wanted. Profile. And now I have my card. Now I have my profile, but inside of my card, I need to import my profile. So I'm going to say import profile from /profile.jsx, and I'm going to put my profile below my h1. Okay, but notice that my profile actually needs some value, so I'm going to ignore them to start, and then we're going to see what happens if I ignore them, and then we'll actually start adding them in and see how that actually works. So I'm not going to use paragraph for now. I'm going to switch to app.jsx, and I'm going to kind of comment these two out, the paragraphs, and I'm going to import card from card.jsx. Notice that we don't need to import profile, right? Because we're using profile inside of card, and React is smart enough to actually put those together because it's being imported from card, and we can just import card, which then imports profile. So here I'm going to put card, and let's just put nothing in here to start and see how that works. Okay, so I'm going to put this card component inside of our app, and it's going to render this, which is also going to render profile. Now, before I show you what the browser is going to show us, I want you to think for a second. What are we going to see show up in our browser, or is it going to show as an error? Okay, so that's card and that's profile. What should we see? Okay, let's switch back here, and let me reload the page. And it looks like we get just app. That is actually not what I was expecting. I was expecting to also see our button here, say hello, and then a blank image. Let me just take a quick look. So that's our H1. That's our profile there. And let me just go into our browser, take a look in the elements. Sometimes we've got to do some debugging here. So we have app, and we're not actually seeing our card. And why is that? So that's our card right here. Import card from card.jsx, and that's being exported correctly. And this is being exported correctly as well. That is confusing me because we have app here, and let me just get rid of these for a second just to make sure that that's not messing it up, and reload that, and we still get just app. Now you can watch me get very confused with the debugging. That shouldn't actually have any impact on this whatsoever. Card from card.jsx. Let's see here. Oh, there we go. So I forgot to return the markup. So in this case, I forgot to actually return this JSX. So I'll leave that in there just so you can see that everybody makes mistakes. In this case, I returned the markup, but I forgot to return it in the card. So I actually was returning undefined for card. So it was actually doing this before, return undefined, which is actually going to show nothing as we see here. But if I comment that out and we actually return our JSX correctly, we should see everything show up. So sorry for the kind of confusion there, but it's important to see that everybody makes mistakes once in a while. And that is one you'll probably make as well at some point, which is why you should always double check your code and try to debug things one at a time. So yeah, we see that name is showing up here, and this H1 is empty over here. So there is an H1 and it's totally empty, taking up quite a bit of space. And then we have our div. And if I open up that div, we have an image here, which is empty. So that's showing up, but there's nothing in there, which is great, but that's what we expect. Our H3 shows name, and then we have a button that says say hello. Okay, so what is actually missing in this case? We are missing our props. Right? We never passed in to our component here the attributes or the properties to actually fill in fname and lname. Right? So I'm going to do that one at a time. I'm going to do it for card first. So here I'm going to say fname is equal to let's go with the Bruce Wayne example. So I'll go with Bruce. I'll save that. I won't pass in lname. And I'll switch back here and we'll see Bruce being logged out, right? So that's coming from our H1 up here, Bruce, but there's no last name because we never passed in the last name, right? So in this case, for our card component, fname is Bruce, but lname is undefined. And I'll prove that here really quick. If I say a console.log, and if I say fname and lname, what we'll see is this is going to be Bruce and this is going to be undefined, right? So if I reload that page and I switch to the console, we'll see that we get Bruce and we get undefined, just as we'd expect. Okay, so now we know in order to actually fix that, we can come back to our app and we can pass in lname is equal to, so you can do this as an object, or you can just, for strings, you can actually just pass it in like this, for example. It really is up to you for specifically for strings. Just be aware that for numbers and other things, they have to be passed in as an object. So, or like as actual, like evaluated JavaScript. So in this case, we get Bruce Wayne, which is fantastic, Bruce Wayne, and that's our H1. But notice that our profile down here is actually not getting anything, right? Its H3 still has a blank name, right? Now that is because we're passing in fname and lname to our card, which is coming in here, we're destructuring it, and then we're displaying it here in the card component correctly. But notice that profile is not being passed any props. So if I was to log out in profile, here, I'll just say profile, spell properly, and I'll say fname and I'll say lname. What do you expect to see here for fname and lname? I want you to think for a second. All right, now I'll switch back here. I'll switch to console, and what we'll see is that for the profile, we get undefined for both of them, right? And we get Bruce Wayne for card. So there's no props being passed into our profile. So how do we fix that? Well, we know how to fix that, right? We can pass in fname is equal to Bruce, for example, and lname is equal to Wayne. We know that we can do that. And I'll just hard code it for now, just so we can see that it actually works. And there we go. We actually now see that this is not only being passed in right here, Bruce Wayne, but if I go to the Elements tab, we can see that this H3 is being populated correctly, and it is down here as well. And our image tag is still empty because we didn't actually put in a source. So that's fantastic. That actually works as we'd expect, but there's something a bit weird here is that we're kind of repeating this, right? Right here, we are repeating it is this one here. I'm getting confused already. See, prop drilling gets very confusing very quickly. We're hard coding Bruce and Wayne in here, but notice in app, we're passing it in as well. So it would be nice to actually grab this from what's being passed in here. And since we know that right now this is Bruce and this is Wayne, in the future this might change, right? The designer of this app or one of our colleagues or ourselves in the future might come in and we might change this to, for example, let's go with Bruce Nain, right? And we go with that. And if I save that, we'll see that this one changes, but this one doesn't, right? Which is probably not what we want. So how do we fix this? Well, instead of hard coding Bruce and Wayne here as well in profile, we can actually just use what's being passed into card, right? We can grab that first name variable that's being passed in as an argument to card, and we can grab the last name variable, which is being passed in as a prop to card as well. And now these get passed in, this gets evaluated to whatever this is, this gets evaluated to whatever this is, and it gets passed in right here. And then we can actually see it displayed in the JSX. And if I switch back, we'll see that we actually get our Bruce name correctly. And now if I change it just in this one place, we'll see that it actually propagates from card to the profile correctly, just as we would expect, which is really, really awesome. Now, I know that was a lot. Prop drilling is definitely a lot in and of itself. So hopefully that makes sense to you. I want to show you one last thing before we call it for this video, which is that you don't really have to name these things the same, right? Here I named it fname and lname, but we saw that over here, that is this example right here where we named a property the same as a property from the parent, but we don't have to do that. You can actually name it something different if you want, and that's what I'm doing here, and I'll just show you how that works as well. So in profile, for example, if I don't want this to be called fname, I can call it first and then call it last. I just have to remember to update it here as well in all the different spots. So you can use kind of some shortcuts to do that, but I'll just do it manually just to so you can see that I'm actually doing this in all these different spots. I'm calling it first and last here, first and last. And if I switch back, we'll see that it's undefined again, right? So we're not actually going to get that logged out because we're not passing in first and last here. We're passing fname and lname. So I'm going to change this part here, which is the name of the property, to first. And if I switch that back, you'll see Bruce shows up. And if I come back in here and I change this to last, we'll see that Nain shows up. Okay, now this is really the power of props and even a little bit of prop drilling in action. And if you ever get confused with this stuff, I highly encourage you to kind of just rename this without the destructuring just to props or something else and actually log out the object in each of your components to actually see what this object being passed in actually is and all the property names and all the property values. But that is pretty much the power of props, which are properties in JavaScript and also in React, as well as prop drilling, which is just an extension where we drill those props through the different components. So I hope that was valuable for you. If you liked this, I would love it if you could like the video and subscribe to the channel. What we're going to do in the next video is a bunch of exercises together to practice both this idea of props and prop drilling, as well as the idea of component composition. And we're going to mishmash them together to really see the power of React with some really fun exercises and probably a bonus as well. So I will see you in the exercise videos. See you later.